15 tires, 15 specific tire models. And for nearly a decade after the government had the failure data in hand, after the blowouts were documented, after the rollovers were counted, after the deaths were filed, those tires stayed on the road, stayed in stores, stayed on vehicles carrying families at highway speeds. This is not a conspiracy. This is just what happened when a regulatory system moves slower than the body count. And by the time number 11 on this list finally got pulled, the paper trail was already years old. If you have ever assumed that a product being sold means a product being safe, this video is going to be uncomfortable. Hit subscribe before we go further, because what follows is the kind of thing they never put in the brochure. The story of tire regulation in America is not a story of immediate response. It is a story of documentation accumulating in filing cabinets while the highway fatality statistics climbed. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA, has the authority to mandate recalls. They also have the authority to investigate. And sometimes those two things happen years apart. The tires on this list represent that gap. Each one had a paper trail. Each one had a mechanism of failure that engineers could describe in precise technical language. And each one kept rolling. Number 1. The Firestone 500 Steel-Belted Radial. This is where the story of modern tire accountability in America actually starts, and it starts badly. The Firestone 500 was introduced in 1972 as Firestone's answer to the radial revolution happening in Europe. Steel-belted radials were supposed to be the future, longer-lasting, better handling, more fuel-efficient than the bias-ply tires that had dominated American roads for decades. Firestone marketed the 500 aggressively. They put it on millions of vehicles. Drivers trusted it because Firestone had been a trusted name in American rubber since 1900. The problem was in the bonding. The steel belt and the rubber in the Firestone 500 had an adhesion issue that became catastrophic under sustained highway heat. The belt would separate from the tread. When that happened at speed, the tire did not slowly deflate. It disintegrated. Tread would peel away from the carcass. Vehicles would lose control instantly. The blowouts were violent, they were sudden, and they were happening across the country. NHTSA opened an investigation in 1977. By 1978, the data showed what every highway patrol officer already suspected. The Firestone 500 was responsible for 41 deaths and 65 injuries that could be directly attributed to belt separation failures. Firestone recalled 7.5 million tires at that point, the largest tire recall in American history. But here's the part that matters for this video. The complaint data had been filing up for years before that recall. Drivers had been reporting tread separation since the tire launched. The documentation existed. The response took until the public pressure became impossible to manage. Number 2. The Firestone ATX and ATX2. If you think the Firestone story ended with the 500 recall, you have not heard the part that comes a generation later. The ATX and ATX2 were original equipment on the Ford Explorer, the best-selling SUV in America through the 1990s. Ford and Firestone had been partners since the early days of the automobile. Henry Ford and Harvey Firestone were personal friends. The relationship ran deep, and it ran right into one of the most consequential product liability disasters in automotive history. The ATX tires were designed to run at lower inflation pressures than typical tires. Ford actually recommended 26 pounds per square inches, well below the tire's rated pressure, because it gave the Explorer a smoother ride and reduced the risk of rollover by lowering the center of gravity. The problem was that lower pressure plus sustained highway heat plus the specific construction of those tires created the exact same belt separation failure mode that had destroyed the Firestone 500. The tread would peel. The Explorer, being a high center of gravity SUV, would roll. NHTSA had received hundreds of complaints about ATX separations through the late 1990s. State Farm Insurance had actually flagged the pattern to NHTSA in 1998. An insurance company noticed the claim pattern before the Federal Safety Agency triggered a formal investigation. The recall finally came in August 2000. By that point, 271 deaths and more than 800 injuries had been linked to the failures. The failure data had been available for years. The tire stayed in production and on vehicles while that data sat. Number 3. The General Tire Ameri-G 4S. Less famous than Firestone, but equally instructive. The Ameri G4S was a passenger car tire sold through the mid-1990s that developed a reputation among mechanics for inner liner separations, a failure mode where the interstructural layer of the tire peels away from the rest of the carcass. Unlike a tread separation, which is visible before failure, an inner liner separation gives you almost no warning. The tire holds its shape and its pressure right up until it does not. NHTSA received complaints. Those complaints were documented. An investigation was opened and then downgraded before a recall was issued. The tires remained in service. It took a series of documented accident reports connecting the Ameri G4S by name before the pressure for action became sufficient. The mechanism here is bureaucratic, not technical. Investigators had the data, the analysis took time, and during that time the tires were on cars. Number 4. The Cooper Tire CST Radial. Cooper had built a reputation as a value alternative to the major brands. Not a luxury tire, but a solid working tire for everyday drivers who did not want to pay Michelin prices. The CST Radial was one of their volume sellers. It was also, according to the complaint data that began accumulating in the late 1980s, developing a specific failure in the sidewall zone near the bead, the part of the tire that seats against the wheel rim. Bead area failures are structurally significant. The bead is what holds the tire on the wheel. When that zone fails, you do not get a slow leak. You get a sudden, complete unseating of the tire from the rim. At highway speeds, in a loaded vehicle, that is a loss of control event. NHTSA collected the complaint data. The investigation moved slowly. The CST remained available through multiple model years after the failure pattern had been identified in the documentation. Number 5. The Uniroyal Tiger Paw. The Tiger Paw is one of the most recognizable names in American tire marketing history. The name suggested grip, traction, the kind of confident performance that a family sedan needed in rain and cold. Uniroyal ran the Tiger Paw name across multiple generations of tire, which is part of what made the situation complicated. Some versions of the Tiger Paw performed well, and some had problems that were specific to particular production runs. The issue with certain Tiger Paw variants centered on treadwear that was uneven in ways that mechanics identified but that consumers could not easily see from a standard visual inspection. The uneven wear created vibration, and in some cases, the tread pattern separated prematurely under load. NHTSA received complaints across multiple years. The multi-generational nature of the product name made it harder to pin the failure pattern to a specific model, and the tires stayed on the market while the complaint data was sorted. Number 6. The Bridgestone Potenza RE71. The Potenza was a performance tire. It was the choice for people who cared about lap times and lateral grip sports car owners, track day enthusiasts, anyone who wanted a tire that communicated what the road surface was doing beneath them. The RE71 had genuine performance credentials. It was a real piece of engineering designed for real demands. The problem was that its performance envelope was very narrow. The RE71 was designed for dry conditions, high grip, high demand driving. When it was sold to and used by consumers who were not operating in those conditions, particularly in colder temperatures or wet conditions that exceeded the tire's design parameters, the compound hardened and grip dropped dramatically. There were documented accidents connected to cold weather traction loss in RE71S being used as year-round tires by consumers who had not understood the limitation. NHTSA had complaint data. The tire remained available. The documentation did not immediately produce a recall because the failure mode was use condition dependent in ways that complicated the causal analysis. Number 7. The Dunlop SP Sport D40M2. Dunlop's SP Sport line was premium original equipment on a range of European and Japanese vehicles that were sold into the American market in the 1990s. When a tire comes as original equipment, consumers tend to assume it was specifically engineered for that vehicle, which it was, and that its replacement should be identical, which it often was not, because consumers would substitute cheaper alternatives when the OE tire wore out. The D40M2 had a specific speed rating and load rating that was appropriate for certain vehicles and completely inappropriate for others. When it was fitted to vehicles outside its specification, something that happened with some frequency in the secondary market, the tire was operating outside its design envelope. NHTSA received reports of failures. The documentation identified the mismatch between the tire spec and the application. The tire remained in distribution while the analysis continued. Number 8. The Yokohama Avid TRZ. Yokohama had been making a serious push into the North American market through the 1990s, and the Avid TRZ was part of that effort, a touring tire positioned as a premium option for family sedans and minivans. It had respectable reviews when it launched. Automotive journalists tested it and found it competent. It went on to a lot of vehicles. The failure pattern that developed over time, centered on sidewall cracking that appeared before the tread, was worn down to the wear indicators. Tires are supposed to give out from the tread surface first. That is what the wear indicators are designed to signal. When the sidewall deteriorates faster than the tread, consumers get no visual warning. They look at their tires, see tread, and assume the tires are safe. Meanwhile, the structural integrity of the sidewall is compromised. Blowouts happen without the expected advance warning. The complaint data on the Avid TRZ mounted over multiple years before the regulatory response matched the documentation. Number 9. The Kumho KH11. Kumho was a Korean manufacturer that had entered the American market as a budget option, not a premium tire, but a tire that offered acceptable performance at a lower price point. The KH11 was sold in volume. It was on a lot of vehicles owned by people who were buying on price, because tires are expensive, and the payment on a reliable used car does not leave a lot of room for a premium set of rubber. The KH11 developed documented problems with tread separation in hot weather, the same class of failure that had plagued the Firestone 500 decades earlier, but caused by different manufacturing quality control issues. NHTSA received complaints. The complaints described a consistent pattern. The documentation was filed. The tire remained available for sale through multiple years of that complaint accumulation. Budget market tires occupy a space where oversight has historically been thinner, and the Kumho KH11 story illustrates exactly why that matters. Number 10. The Goodyear Load Range E-Lite Truck Tire. Goodyear is the most American name in tires. The Goodyear Blimp, the Goodyear Eagle, the name that has been on Indy cars and on pickup trucks and on every kind of vehicle in between. The Load Range E is a heavy-duty designation for tires designed to carry significant weight, the kind of tires you put on a truck that is actually doing truck work, hauling, towing, operating under load. The specific failure pattern documented in certain Load Range E variants involved what is called zipper failure, a catastrophic sidewall rupture that produces a zipper-like tear along the tire's circumference. Zipper failures are violent. They are loud, they are sudden, and they are especially dangerous on trucks because trucks are heavy and a sudden blowout on a heavy vehicle at highway speed is a serious control event. NHTSA had documented zipper failure complaints on specific production runs. The investigation and the recall did not happen simultaneously. The tires were on working trucks in the gap between those two events. Number 11. The Continental ContiTrack. The ContiTrack was an all-terrain light truck tire, the kind of tire sold to pickup and SUV owners who wanted some off-road capability without completely sacrificing highway manners. Continental is a German company with a long engineering pedigree. The ContiTrack had solid reviews. It was on a lot of trucks and SUVs in the early 2000s. The failure data that accumulated on the ContiTrack centered on tread separation in high load, high heat conditions, the kind of conditions that existed when you had a fully loaded truck running highway speeds in summer temperatures. The same temperature, stress, adhesion, failure mode that appeared throughout this list appeared here. NHTSA received the complaints. The analysis of the failure mechanism matched what engineers would have predicted from the construction. The tire remained in distribution through an extended period of complaint documentation. Continental eventually addressed the issue, but the timeline between first complaint and resolution stretched across years. Number 12. The Michelin XZX. This one is going to be the hardest to hear because Michelin has spent decades building a reputation that is essentially the entire argument against cutting corners on tires. The Michelin Man. The safety messaging. The premium price point justified by superior engineering. The XZX was a radial tire from an earlier era of Michelin's North American expansion, and its problems were a product of the learning curve involved in bringing European tire technology to American road conditions. American roads and American driving habits place different demands on tires than European conditions: higher sustained highway speeds, different temperature ranges, different road surfaces. The XX had been developed for European conditions, and certain versions of it that were sold into the American market showed stress patterns in the carcass under American conditions that were not anticipated in the original design. The complaints that reached NHTSA were specific and documented. The response was measured against the scale of Michelin's overall quality reputation in ways that complicated the timeline. The tires' problems were real. The documentation was filed. The resolution took longer than the documentation would have suggested. Number 13. The Sears Guardsman. Not every tire on this list comes from a tire company. Some come from retailers who had their tires manufactured by third parties and sold them under store brand names. Sears was one of the largest tire retailers in America for decades. The Guardsman was their house brand affordable tires for Sears customers who trusted the Sears name the same way they trusted Sears appliances and Sears tools. The Guardsman's problems were manufacturing consistency problems. When a retailer outsources tire production, quality control depends entirely on the manufacturing contract and the oversight that the retailer maintains over production. In certain Guardsman variants, belt adhesion and tread compound consistency did not meet the specifications that were supposed to govern production. Failures occurred. Complaints were filed with NHTSA. The documentation connected the Guardsman name to a pattern of failures. The tire remained in the Sears catalog through multiple sales cycles after that documentation existed. When a product is a store brand sold through a retailer rather than through dedicated tire channels, accountability gaps open up that are different from the gaps that existed with manufacturer brands. Number 14. The Multi-Mile Wild Country XRT. The Wild Country XRT was a popular off-road and all-terrain truck tire sold through independent tire dealers, the shops that are not national chains, the places where you deal with a local owner who knows your name and knows your truck. Multi-Miles sold in volume through those channels. The Wild Country name suggested rugged capability, and for a lot of its applications, the tire delivered. The documented failure mode on certain XRT production runs involved belt edge separations that initiated from the shoulder area, the transition zone between the tread face and the sidewall. Shoulder area failures are particularly relevant on truck tires because truck tires carry loads that stress the shoulder zone in ways that passenger car tires do not. The mechanics who saw the failures could describe the failure pattern precisely. The complaint data that reached NHTSA reflected that precision. The tire remained in distribution through the years that data was accumulating, sold through channels where oversight was thinner than it was for the major retail chains. Number 15. The Summit Ultramax. The Summit brand was a value-tier tire sold through a distribution chain that prioritized price accessibility. The Ultramax was positioned as a budget all-season tire for the consumer who needed tires today and needed them to cost less than the premium alternatives. There is nothing inherently wrong with budget tires. There is something wrong with budget tires that have documented structural failures and remain on shelves. The Ultramax accumulated complaint data related to tread separation and sidewall integrity failures over a period that stretched across multiple years. The failure pattern was consistent enough that the documentation told a clear story. NHTSA received the complaints. The investigations moved at the pace that investigations moved. The tires continued to be sold to consumers who had no way of knowing what was in the complaint database because that database is not something most people know to consult before they buy tires. If you're the kind of person who wants to actually know what is in NHTSA's complaint database before you buy tires and after this video, you should be. The address is nhtsa.gov, and the complaints database is publicly searchable by tire brand and model. That is not a promotional resource. That is a federal database that exists specifically to give you the information you need before you make a decision that affects whether you make it home. Go use it. Every single tire on this list had something in common that had nothing to do with the manufacturer's country of origin or the price point or the marketing. Every single one had a gap, a documented, filed, traceable gap between when the failure data existed in a government database and when the tire was removed from availability. That gap is not a conspiracy. It is a system. The system has a pace. The pace is set by investigation timelines, by legal standards for establishing causal connection, by the resources available to NHTSA's compliance and enforcement divisions, and by the political and economic pressure that comes from industries that have a significant interest in investigations moving slowly. The Transportation Recall Enhancement, Accountability, and Documentation Act, the TREAD Act, was passed in 2000 directly in response to the Firestone ATX disaster. It required manufacturers to report foreign recalls to NHTSA, mandated early warning reporting of claims and complaints, and tightened the timelines and requirements around how tire safety data had to be handled. It was written in response to a specific catastrophe. That is how most of these regulations get written, not in anticipation of harm. in response to harm that had already happened and been counted. The tires on this list were not outliers. They were data points in a pattern that the Tread Act was specifically designed to interrupt. Some of them came before the Tread Act, some came after it. The ones that came after it are the uncomfortable ones because the system had already been reformed once by the time they moved through it, and the gaps still existed. Next time you are standing in a tire shop and you are looking at a price board, you are now the person in that room who knows that a complaint database exists and knows how to search it. That changes the conversation you can have with the person behind the counter. Drop a comment telling me which of these 15 surprised you most, not which one was the most famous, but which one genuinely changed how you think about the product you are riding on every time you drive. Next video, I am going deep on the safety standards that are currently under review tests that were written decades ago that may not reflect what modern vehicles actually do in real crashes. Some of those standards have not been updated since before the vehicles being tested were designed. That gap is real, it is documented, and it is worth knowing about before you decide what to put your family in.